Hello and welcome to my presentation. My name is Dr. Maria Marshall, and this presentation is entitled From Fear to Trust. I'm going to share with you some of the slides that I prepared for this presentation, and they are going to guide us through our slides. Start with the first one, approaching the neuropsychological and the spiritual in the context of a three-dimensional view of the human person. This presentation was dedicated to the memory of Dr. Sveta Pahljina. Dr. Pahljina is a good friend and a colleague. She was a logotherapist in Croatia, whom I had the honor of meeting at Viktor Frankl's lecture series by Dr. Elizabeth Lucas in Fürstenfeldbruck. We were students there together, and we had a wonderful connection. Dr. Pahljina happened to know my father, Dr. Paul Ungar, who used to be a student of Viktor Frankl's. I would like to preface this presentation with the quotation by Viktor Frankl. If we wanted to build a bridge from person to person, and this applies to a bridge of reconciliation and understanding, the bridge heads must not be the heads, but the hearts. The objectives of this presentation are the following. First of all, to explore the biopsychological mechanisms underlying fear and trust. Next, to examine existential phenomena related to fear and trust. And finally, to consider the ways in which meaning orientation can foster trust to avoid despair. I would like to begin with, of course, an overview of Viktor Frankl's work and his life, because that would lead us into an understanding of this topic. Viktor Frankl, from 1905 to 1997, was a doctor, neurologist, psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and philosopher. He's credited with rehumanizing medicine, psychotherapy, and human sciences. He accomplished this through the introduction and a conceptualization of the human person and the view of the human person as a unitas multiplex. Unitas multiplex is a Latin word. It means unity despite diversity, the human person in three dimensions. And the other relevant concept is monanthropism. Monanthropism meaning one humanity. Every person is a body, mind, and spirit entity. The three-dimensional view of the human person of Viktor Frankl can be understood as follows. The body, the first dimension, is something that we can touch, measure, that we can directly explore its functions and understand its mechanisms. It is a reservoir of physical resources, physiological, neurological processes. The mind is understood as the reservoir and the dimension of psychological processes, of cognition, perception, memory, thinking, and emotion. Whereas the spirit is the core and essence of the person, a dimension that is higher and more encompassing than the dimensions of body and mind. It is not a substance, but a dynamics, the seat of the will to meaning, the defined power of the human spirit, conscience, capacity for self-distancing, self-transcendence, humor, gratitude, love, hope, faith. The sources of this presentation, you can find them here. Some of them are listed here, are Viktor Frankl's books, books by logotherapists, and other research articles that tie in with this topic. What is meant by the unconditional human? The unconditional human refers to the dimension of the spirit and the healthy core of the person. It understands the spirit as a non-material dynamics oriented toward meaning. Meaning in Viktor Frankl's thought is conceptualized as an objective reality of values standing in relation to a person. Therefore, meaning is not something subjective, it is not something that is invented, is not something that is created, but rather something that is discovered. The dimension of spirit is higher and more encompassing dimension than the dimensions of body and mind. While body and mind are finite and vulnerable, they are the instruments of the human spirit, through which the spirit expresses itself. Therefore, we can speak of vulnerability on one hand and intactness on the other hand. Body and mind are vulnerable. They can become ill, they can become affected by the environment, by the past, by what our genetic inheritance may be, or the ways in which other people influence us, or may even hurt us, or illnesses that affect us. Whereas the core of the person is characterized by its intactness. The core of the person is a healthy self. Therefore, in Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, we talk about a tertium datur, a third given. The psychophysical parallel refers to the parallel of body and mind, whereas the psychonoetic antagonism compares the dynamics of the spirit that cannot become ill, that it cannot be subject to outside influences, and the healthy core of the person. This leads us to the psychological creed of Viktor Frankl, that the person can be disturbed but not destroyed. And the other creed, the second creed, the psychiatric creed, which accompanies the first one, the psychological creed, that behind the mask of the disease, the spirit is intact, the spiritual person is there. Dialectics in the context of meaning include that our existence is not conditioned being, which cannot be, which is not a one way of being, but is always in a state of evolution, a state of change, a state of potential. We can always choose to change ourselves, develop ourselves. Human beings are not fully conditioned or determined, but they determine themselves, whether to give in to these conditions or to stand up to them. In other words, human beings are ultimately self-determined. The physical makes possible the mental realization of a spiritual demand. These are Viktor Frankl's words. The physical and the mental are the instruments of the spirit through which the will to meaning can be actualized. What is meaningful can become actualized and become real in the world. Now, shifting then to fear, since our topic is from fear to trust. Fear is a fundamental emotion. Our basic emotions include happiness, fear, sadness, and anger. They have been related, states of fear, to, of course, anxiety, which is a longer lasting state of apprehension, fear, and being warded from something, a feeling that something is going to happen that is going to affect the self and maybe threaten the existence of the self. Other affective affective states include happiness, which is associated with reward functions in the brain, sadness, which is associated with punishment, and fear and anger, which are related to stress. We could conceptualize the three affective states, reward, punishment, and sadness, as the three primary colors of red, blue, and yellow, which are also encoded in the brain. Fear has its advantages and disadvantages. It has evolutionary adaptive value, so it has its positives and negatives. The evolutionary value, of course, is that fear serves the preservation of our lives. When it's realistic, it protects us from danger. But excessive fear blocks us down, and therefore the management of fear ensures that we can use the energy of this fear to our advantage. In the neuropsychology of fear, we need to address the physiology related to fear states and state of fear and of anxiety. The recognition of anger occurs in the parahippocampal gyrus, the cerebellum amygdala cortical pathway. Here you see an illustration of that, although it's a little bit covered up here by my picture, but you can see how the fear pathways travel through the neural pathways, and they are very fast, the recognition of the fear. The unconscious registration of fear occurs 100 milliseconds after the stimulus is presented, and the conscious registration of fear only 400 milliseconds after the stimulus is presented. The interpretation and modulation and the processing of fear occurs in the cortical and subcortical regions. So we see that a complex neural mechanism is involved in the quick processing in order to ensure an appropriate and quick response to something that would threaten our existence. The neuropsychology of fear covers those and recognizes those reactions that are related to the processing of anxiety-provoking stimuli. And these are associated with sympathetic nervous system activity, such as enhanced skin conductance, increased eye blink frequency, increased pupil dilation, accelerated heart rate, increased autonomic arousal, and decreased parasympathetic activity. Fear and language go close together. Of course, it's very important to be able to possess the capacity to express in language our internal experience and experience of fear. Self-awareness about fear helps to identify our internal experiences and tonalities and allows to verbalize these with different expressions that cover the different shades and tones, the different affect related to our internal experience. Fear and stress research, of course, is very vast. And from the very early research, which goes back to Hans Selye in the 1970s, it recognizes that fear leads to a fight or flight response. When fear is very intense, we may experience that we are seemingly paralyzed toward of the effects of stress. There is an optimal arousal, which enhances our way of perceiving stress and finding a quick response to it. But when fear becomes very intense, this can be counterproductive and even slow down our emotional processing, our intellectual capacity to process fear and its consequences. So we basically block down by the fear. Prolonged toxic stress leads to a depletion of the body's resources associated with physical and emotional disorders. Unreasonable fear, when fear and anticipatory anxiety are associated, of course, with anxiety disorders. These are related to long-standing condition of fears. It also has been noted by research that neuroplasticity and the brain's remarkable capacity to mediate, to modify, to moderate the fear response and to form new connections helps to mediate the effects of stress and fear in the nervous system. Our emotions point to value. Arousal that is correlated with brain states is paralleled by physiological responses, an inner source of energy that informs us about our values, about our value system, and our value hierarchy. We may notice that we feel sadness following a loss. Why? Because we feel that we lost something that was valuable to us. So this feeling of sadness is associated with love. Or we may feel an intense anger about wastefulness, the wasteful use of resources. Why? Because we value the good use of resources. Or we feel disgust about lies. Why? Because we value truth. So this is how emotions can also indicate what things are important to us, what things are valuable to us. Emotions are what we have rather than what we are. Our heart and emotional and rational brain work together in discerning, therefore, what is of value to us, what is of meaning to us in each situation, and which values to actualize. In the existential aspect of fear, since we are talking about Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, which is closely related to an existential understanding of fear, we need to then mention the dynamics and the dimension that is the existential dynamic related to our subjective experience of fear and anxiety. The existentialists, like Søren Kierkegaard, for example, talked about existential angst. Existential threat is what we use in colloquial language. Existential risk may also be another word that we are increasingly familiar with, a risk that threatens the destruction of humanity's long-term potential. These are phenomenological states that occur when the voice of conscience is ignored, repressed, suppressed, and the will to meaning is blocked or frustrated when our usual way of fulfilling meaning are not possible. And these have been described by Viktor Frankl, such as existential vacuum, the existential frustration, leading to further down along the spectrum to existential distress that can lead to neogenic neurosis, the hallmark of which is anxiety, and the hallmark of which is fear, an existential struggle that results from values transgressions. The fear of fear, the fighting off, the excessive fighting of fear can increase the fear. And Frankl has described this in the form of anticipatory anxiety. Angst can give rise to individual neurotic patterns. And these patterns further block the will to meaning. The threat can give rise to collective neurotic patterns. These collective neurotic patterns are present in provisory attitude, in nihilism, in excessive negativism, in collectivism, in fanaticism, in reductionism. And these are ways of being in the world that are unhelpful and present a risk for being not in tune with our will to meaning, but enclosed and limited to our internal world, the world of our feelings and emotions and fears, at the cost of being able to genuinely be attuned to the will to meaning. Therefore, how we respond to fear is crucial to break the pattern blocking the will to meaning that can lead gradually to despair. Trust. We many times think of trust as the opposite of fear. Here we are going to review a little bit the psychological research related to the phenomenon of trust. Trust is an emotional brain state, a complex neural process that binds diverse representations into a semantic pointer that includes emotions. These are the scientific definition of trust, the psychological definition of trust. A feeling of confidence and security, an abstract mental attitude toward the proposition that someone is dependable, and the probability that someone will behave in a certain way. About the neuropsychology of trust, we need to mention the following processes. That trust is processed, you will see that it's a little bit different from the fear reaction. Through the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the insula, the amygdala, and the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex is involved in the processing of trust. Interesting to notice that research has found that the volume of these brain regions and structures increases in people who have more trust, in people who have put trust in others. So people who are in general trusting have a higher density of brain structures in these areas than those people who are likely to be fearful, anxious, and whose patterns of response mostly include anxious or fearful patterns of responding. So even the brain structures, we mentioned earlier, brain plasticity and neuroplasticity is different, slightly bit different in people who trust or who put their trust in things that are reliable and who decide to be trusting. What more can trust research tell us about trust? Erik Erikson, again, we go back a bit historically, has talked very extensively, of course, about trust and mistrust that develops very early on in life, from between 0 to 2 years of age, that he emphasized that a secure and trusting bond, a trusting relationship, fosters secure connections later in life. In a similar vein, it has been found that traumatic events reduce the amount of trust that one experiences. Research has also found that one can learn to develop trust if one faces fears. Trust mediates the perception of threat in the world and in others. Therefore, reducing fear and enhancing trust is the main precondition of enhancing social concern and peacemaking, and that's on an individual level and the global level. However, we need to note that trust cannot be forced. There is an element of choice and a decision involved with trust. There is a will related to those related to a will to place our trust in things that are worthwhile, in things that are valuable. So a value elicits trust. Trust cannot be forced. Trust cannot be demanded. There is a colloquial saying that trust has to be earned. We place in trust, we make a leap of faith when we place our trust in people, in things, and that is related to a perception of value, when we have a perception of what is worthwhile. In other words, when we are discerning of value, when we discern a value and we want to actualize meaning. Similarly to we talked about the existential elements of fear, now we are going to address the existential element of trust. The opposite of existential angst is basic trust. Erik Erikson talked about a fundamental trust that develops early in childhood, which can be easily lost when one encounters trauma, and then one needs to slowly, carefully rebuild it. And through neuroplasticity and through the flexibility of the person and the choices of the person, that can be rebuilt. But Frankl's notion of trust is different. Frankl's notion of trust is basic trust, that is ultimately a belief in life's meaningfulness, in an overall encompassing dimension, in which, despite that reasonably we may not be able to understand the reason of our suffering or everything, how it fits together, but a trust that there is a higher dimension in which, even without our understanding, there can be an ultimate meaning, an ultimate reason that encompasses the whole of creation, and that is the reason and the foundation of the whole of creation of which we are part of. So if the whole is meaningful, in that context of meaning, every part has meaning, every detail has meaning, every little part of the little mosaic has its own place and fits together in a reasonable and meaningful way, even if we have a hard time understanding this. Among other things, this basic trust means an awareness of our uniqueness and irreplaceable singularity, as well as our value in the world. There are ways of regaining basic trust. Basic trust can be fostered through opening our eyes to possibilities, our ability to do good, to offer a contribution, to be good for something, that we are here for a purpose, for a reason in the world, to open our eyes to the wonder of the world, through gratitude, through kindness, through formation, changing and building ourselves, through growing, through the willingness to be open to change, growth, experiences, and insights. Joseph Fabry also described ways of fostering this basic trust, and thus through an orientation to meaning, through an insight into our uniqueness, through an insight into our choices, the capacity of self-distancing, our capacity for self-transcendence, through our responsibility and the ability to responsibly act in our surroundings. Thus, our responsibility, our ability to respond to the questions that life poses to us and the ways in which life addresses us, whether through good times or through difficult times and challenging times. Attentive meaning sensitivity is a capacity and a competence that we have described earlier that can be fostered. Attentive meaning sensitivity is this attunement to values that present themselves all the time and at every time in our lives. And through this sensitivity, we can become aware of these values, and we can actualize these values by being very sensitive to which value stands closest to us and in relation to us, and identifying that as the most meaningful option that we can actualize, then bring into reality and create something that is true, beautiful, and good in the world, which are the aspects of meaning. The principal model of the freedom of will was proposed by Edward Marshall and myself, and it is based on research that brings into a freedom of will research that is a non-reductionistic research. That is, it is not denying the freedom of will, but upholding it and emphasizing it in our everyday circumstances. So what is freedom of will research saying about our capacity to make free choices? And this is the neural basis of it. Human beings can make decisions about which values to live for. And this is a slow process related to the cortical brain activity associated with reasoning. These values are then sorted in a conceptual memory regulated by the cortical limbo diencephalic system to guide everyday decisions. And this is a fast process involving limbic structures associated with emotions. What is the meaning of this research? The meaning of this research is that we are able to reflect on the values that we want to live for, and we are able to choose the values that we want to encode. And then quickly, in situations, we are able to relate to those values, and we are able to choose the actions that are in line with those values. So although our decisions may seem to be made at the split second, and it may not take us a too long time to make a decision, such as a person, for example, who dives in to save someone into the water at the split of a second of a decision, seemingly not making a free choice in the moment. Yet, the merit of that person has to do with a lifelong pattern of having cultivated decisions step by step and values that respect the value of another person's life, the value of being there for someone else. So if they see someone struggling in the water, they are going to dive right in. They are going to help that person, even though to the outsider, that may look like that was done at a split second and there was not much free choice involved. And the person, when you interview them later, may say, I just did my duty. I just did what I thought was the right thing to do. Yet what is the merit of this person is a lifelong pattern of having built a life based on respecting others, valuing others, being there for others, developing their strength to be available for others in the moment, being there and actualizing the meaning of the moment. So we are able to reflect on the values and choose values in harmony with universal values. And what are these universal values? These universal values have to do with the value of human life, the dignity of life, truth, beauty, and goodness, aspects of meaning. Not everything that one can actualize is good. Not everything that one can actualize is beautiful. Not everything that one can become is in harmony with the truth. So therefore, if we live and work in harmony with truth, beauty, and goodness, that's how we can bring peace into our lives. Human beings can choose which values they can actualize, and thereby we can shape ourselves, we can form ourselves, we can mold ourselves. We are not free from conditions, but we are free to. We are free to bring something valuable into the world. Functional brain imaging shows interesting differences between those individuals who were given everyday tasks to reflect on. And that is something what we usually associate with rumination, thinking without necessarily accomplishing something worthwhile or valuable, but just thinking and processing without linking those processes with necessarily a value to be actualized in the outside world. So this rumination showed a different area of brain activation than those individuals who have been given tasks that related to reflecting on their values and what values were important to them. So we see the frontal lobe activation, and that is different than when people ruminate. Reflection has to do with observing an experience from different angles, different perspectives, different views, different contexts, and being open to conscious and unconscious resources. So being able to reflect on values brings into mind that we need to discover objective meaning in the world, not subjective meaning, not something that is based on our feelings, not something that is based on our internal world, but relate to that internal world and link heart with mind, with the actualization of what is most meaningful in a particular moment. And this brings in then the area of freedom to choose one's ways, to responsibly act in one's environment. When we manage to find this area of freedom, this inner freedom, to take an attitude, to take a stand, not only to the outside circumstances, but also to our inner self, to choose our inner attitude even toward ourselves, then we put our trust that there is meaning in the world, that there is a good and true and beautiful, a valuable way of responding even to our own feelings. And in those times, we may be surprised with joy. Joy comes into our lives when there is something to do. There is someone to love, and there is someone, something to hope for. And these are the words of Viktor Frankl. Resilience and self-transcendence are concepts related to faith, hope, and trust. There is a lot of research that has showed that we do not need to be the victims of our faith, but we can be the masters of our faith. Through self-regulation, through self-awareness, we can mold ourselves, we can shape ourselves. A research by Southwick and Charney, for example, found that among the survivors of trauma, there are certain people who can be described as not only survivors, but super survivors. These individuals managed to go beyond just coping with the trauma to making the best of the trauma, using it to their advantage, to their benefit, in a way to be there for others, to advance others, to use their knowledge, to use their experience, to further themselves and to stand by others because they have a unique understanding of what it is like to experience that trauma, of what it is like to be in that phenomenological state of experiencing and having experienced trauma, and how one is able to get out from the grips of fear and put oneself in the hands of trust, make that leap of faith, then start slowly rebuilding their lives. And what they have found most helpful is to be there for others, support others, and through that, build up the self. And so this is the lesson from super survivors, that we can build ourselves up when we are there for the other, when we help the other. And isn't this what Viktor Frankl did when he wrote Man's Search for Meaning? He did not write it for himself. He did not write it only for his recollections. He did not write it only to have his experiences recorded. There is a message that comes to us through the experience of survivors and super survivors, even of the Holocaust. That is a message that you can do it too. You can take on this torch in the midst of your suffering, in the midst of your life, in the midst of your challenges. You can also be a victor, a survivor, and even a super survivor. When you place your hope and faith in trust that there is meaning that encompassing every detail, every aspect of life, and imbues our being, our very essence with meaning. It is with us, it is within us, and we can discover it. Otherwise, it would be useless to think about meaning if we did not have the trust that it can be found, that we can be met by it. And when we meet with it, and when we existentially are confronted with it, when we can discover it, that gives rise to joy, to genuine satisfaction, to genuine happiness. When we don't aim for it, we don't seek it directly, but we accomplish something meaningful. And the byproduct of that is satisfaction and joy. Research proves the positive outcome, the positive health outcomes that are related to finding meaning. Life purpose was associated with lower all-cause mortality. And this has been proven in many different ways and through different research with large sample sizes. Research findings and clinical significance also proved that death wishes among the elderly could not be explained away by mental disorders. These trajectories could be varied in intensity and they can fluctuate. But that once they become ingrained, once they become a steady companion, they can be ingrained all to the point that the elderly and those who are most vulnerable and those who find themselves in helpless or seemingly hopeless situations really express death wishes, and that becomes ingrained in their language, and that becomes ingrained in the narrative. And so how do we turn this around, this diminished wish for hastened death? We can turn it around by diminishing this wish for hastened death, by a regained sense of meaningfulness and forming of connectedness, regaining a connection with oneself, regaining a connection with others, regaining a connection with the world, and regaining a connection with the meaningfulness, a sense of meaning of the world. Structured meaning-centered interventions have been developed, and they have been tested extensively at the Sloan Kettering Cancer Treatment Center by Dr. Breitbart and his associates. Here we are just going to briefly maybe review the main points of them. They cover concepts and sources of meaning, identity before and after the diagnosis of cancer, historical sources of meaning, life as a legacy that one has been given, historical sources of meaning, life as a legacy that one lives and what one wants to give, the attitudinal sources of meaning, encountering life's limitations, creative sources of meaning, creativity, courage, responsibility, experiential sources of meaning, connecting with life through love, beauty, and humor, and transitions, a final set of reflections and hopes for the future. The researchers found lower scores of depressiveness, anxiety, and wish for hastened death among people who participated in this program. Similarly, by other researchers, meaning was found to correlate with measures of self-transcendence, resilience, and post-traumatic growth, which were factors related to well-being. In conclusion, we could then say that trust is the antidote of existential angst. Trust is fostered when we point to the value of life to actualize meaning in life. Neuroplasticity based on discernment and reflection can aid to reinforce the values that we want to live for and that are in harmony with universal values. Through the resources of the human spirit, fear can be tamed and basic trust can be regained for a meaning-filled life. Meaning is associated with self-transcendence, resilience, and post-traumatic growth. These factors are associated with positive health and mental health outcomes. It is currently in research and among researchers, clinical researchers, especially emphasized and noticed that research on the role of purpose is a new and upcoming movement in neuroscience. Purpose in life should be promoted as opposed to just pill pushing. Offering physical care is crucial in palliative medicine, according to Dr. Breitbart. Beyond that, it is equally important to encourage the spirit by a constant show of love and compassion. It is essential to enhance resilience through meaningful connections. In conclusion, furthermore, we notice that logotherapy, and we know that logotherapy and existential analysis has been formulated at a time when the search for meaning was crucial as a preventive and a protective factor against despair. Much of the psychology of the time, and maybe even today, we may notice is focused on deficiencies, on what we don't have, on what is wrong with us. But Viktor Frankl's logotherapy and existential analysis brings into mind what is right with us, what is a strength, what is inside, what is within ourself, our core, that cannot be erased, that cannot be harmed, that cannot be hurt, that cannot be taken away, and that is within our area of freedom to get in tune with and to use, even in our healing and reconnection and forming and building of trust. And in that trust, our way of taming our fear and anxiety. Logotherapy is a values-based approach with meaning-centered principles and evidence-based methods. Maybe not many people know that Viktor Frankl himself was afraid of heights, but he challenged himself the same way as he challenged his patients, and he posed himself the question. He was not afraid of posing himself the question, who is stronger, me or the fear in me? And he sometimes playfully refers to it as the beast in me, the beast of the fear in me. Viktor Frankl used proper gear, his mountaineering equipment. And among his mountaineering equipment, one of them, the nails, those little spokes that he used, and as well those strong spokes that he used for climbing, and the rope that he used, they are found in the Viktor Frankl Museum today. Rope can be used as a symbol. It is a symbol of our connectedness to others. Rope can be used as a chain, binding us as the slave of fear. Rope can also be untangled and used, put around our waist and tied onto our source of strength and our source of trust and faith. So it can be a symbol of our connectedness to our eternal home. When we learn about logotherapy, we not only help ourselves, but we also learn how to help and guide others conquer the heights with courage, faith, and trust. Anchored in ultimate trust, we can say yes to life in spite of adversities, in spite of everything. Thank you very much for your attention. The following are the references for this presentation, which are quite extensive. I hope you will find them helpful as you continue on your way in the search for meaning, in putting your hope in faith and trust in meaning that can be ours, and it can be ours every day, every moment in life. Thank you very much.